Thank you. Thank you. And good morning. I also want to start with all of the proper acknowledgments and acknowledge that we are, of course, meeting on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I want to offer special acknowledgement to our guests from Mapuche who've traveled so far to be with us. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me and asking me to participate, and hope we can have a very good conversation today. Well, from my introduction, it's clear I am not a lawyer. I am not a legal scholar. I approach Indigenous rights from a political science, particularly international relations perspective. And in my work, my scholarly work, I now look at politics of rights, everything from the grassroots level all the way up to the UN global level. I look at recognition of rights, and now that's increasingly shifting over to implementation of Indigenous rights. That's the new conversation. So I'm looking at implementation both on the international level and then in specific domestic contexts around the world. And today I've been asked to spend my time providing some background and some international context on customary law and how that can protect and strengthen Indigenous political orders from within. So I want to take my time this morning to talk a little bit about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, how that relates to international customary law, and then finally, how it relates to specific Indigenous political and legal orders on the local level. So the good and logical, reasonable place to start is to just give you a bit of background for those of you who aren't familiar with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It passed the UN General Assembly on 13 September 2007, so it's a little bit over 8 years old. We just celebrated the anniversary last week. It passed only after 3 decades or so of intense work by Indigenous political activists in multitudes of committees and subcommittees and working groups, and with significant resistance from nation states. So after these 3 decades of work by this Indigenous rights movement, getting the declaration passed was quite a significant achievement. So what can we say about it? It represents, as it were, a global consensus now, a consensus between Indigenous activists and the nation states as to what Indigenous peoples have in terms of rights that all states are morally, politically obligated to recognize and protect. It's important to remember that as a declaration, it's not a treaty, it's not an international convention, it is without official enforcement mechanisms on the global level. What it is, in essence, is a set of expectations by which it becomes a moral and political tool to be used and implemented on an individual state-by-state basis. Now, the vote for it was 143 countries yes, out of 192 member states at that time. There were 11 abstentions and 4 votes against. And for those of you who aren't familiar with who voted against, it was Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. However, all of these states within a couple years officially changed their position to say they were endorsing it or throwing their support to it. However, and I have to bring this out every time, their support came with a significant set of footnotes, caveats, exclusions, especially around land rights, self-determination, and the now increasingly relevant free, prior, and informed consent issue. The UN Declaration, however, before we get too negative, does represent a set of guidelines, a set of minimum standards for how Indigenous state relationships should be structured from now and into the future. And how does that fit within the global discourse? Well, Professor James Anaya from University of Arizona, who is the recently completed Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples earlier this year, has written that a norm of customary international law can emerge and crystallize when a preponderance of states or other international non-state actors converge on a common understanding of what the norm means, and then the expectation along with that is that states will then conform their behavior to the norm. So Anaya says that an international customary norm or law is understood to have two key elements: material and psychological. So the material element is that which actually asks states to change their behavior or conduct themselves in a particular way that conforms to the norm. The psychological element, Anaya tells us, is that which centers on this notion of oughtness, what ought to be. And Anaya says, for example, this is a practice of, we see diplomatic immunity between different countries. If you get a parking ticket and you're a diplomat, you will not be prosecuted for that. There is no international law around it. It's a set of oughtness. It's a way of practicing. Now, UN General Assembly resolutions, like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, do play an important role in the establishment and crystallization of what we call international customary law. And there are three possible ways that they can do this. General Assembly resolutions have been cited as evidence as customary law in particular court cases. For example, 1975 was a very noted case, Western Sahara case, which established principles of self-determination, and the International Court of Justice relied very heavily on UN General Assembly resolutions to establish what the legal principles of self-determination were. Secondly, General Assembly resolutions and recommendations also provide evidence of a prevailing attitude or of a critical mass of states with respect to a particular issue. And with the UN Declaration, I think we could say, with 143 states voting yes out of 192 member states, this can be deemed to represent a majority of global opinion. It certainly indicates a clear direction on into the future. And third, customary law, it's important to note, and this is where it gets a little bit sticky, a state that presents objections to a particular international norm is deemed not to be bound by it. So, for example, we have seen the United States issue statement after statement after statement about how it's opposed exactly to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and actually about a 16-page document articulating all of its objections. The U.S. is doing all of this because it does not want to be bound in sort of international jurisdictions on the Declaration. Professor Anaya and others have argued, however, that in spite of all these protests by countries like the United States, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People does, in fact, in part, reflect already customary international law. In spite of the 4 negative votes by the English-speaking settler states, and all of the written statements by the United States, and the 11 abstentions, and the 34 states that were absent the day of the vote. He says, and the changes in position by those 4 Anglo-speaking settler states also indicates a normative change in direction. So those states, after a few years of pressure, did feel the need to come along and at least throw some support, even if there were footnotes and caveats to it. So if we begin from the standpoint of Professor Anaya, that the UN Declaration is actually already international customary law. What does that mean for indigenous legal and political orders on the ground? And also, what sort of challenges are associated with that? Now, the vast majority of the UN Declaration is devoted to either, first of all, rights against discrimination. These rights are already well substantiated as international law, but the UN Declaration does provide specific indigenous content and context, because even though indigenous peoples have been officially included under this human rights umbrella since the beginning of human rights following World War II, massive abuses against indigenous people in this category of rights have continued all around the world. Secondly, the UN Declaration has what I call soft rights. I call them soft rights to indicate that state resistance towards them tends to be soft. These are what some call cultural rights. These include rights of language, culture, religion, spirituality, identity, education, so on and so forth. So although there's plenty of room for improvement, most state practices and most states are willing to align these soft rights, which are presented in multiple international instruments and can also be considered international customary law. They're also soft because state resistance against them, as I said, is lighter, and states are more comfortable with them because they can accommodate them in terms of ethnic minorities along the ethnic minority train. And certainly in a multicultural country like Canada, these are very softly resisted. However, the most contentious part of the UN Declaration is what I call the hard rights, meaning there remains substantial state resistance to them. And hard rights are most notably land rights and self-determination. Now, in one sense, self-determination is the foundational principle of the UN Declaration around which all the rest of the rights flow and circulate. But it is so feared and so resisted by states because states tend towards a very conservative viewpoint on the term, and they interpret it in the old ways as meaning specifically a right of secession from the state, and they therefore find the word itself alarming. But indigenous rights activists are trying to assuage some of those concerns for states and argue that actually self-determination is gradually changing and shifting and morphing in meaning from the old decolonization meaning from the 1950s to about the 1990s, and shifting into something now more universally understood as rights of autonomy or self-government, or it's not specifically a state-centric meaning any longer. Article 3 of the UN Declaration says specifically that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, equal to all other peoples, which means they have the right, internationally recognized, to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Now, it's said and understood that this can mean a host of multitude of possibilities, sometimes called self-government, sometimes called autonomy, and it also means, and this is important to remember, different levels of political engagement with the state, and these may differ substantially in contexts around the world. This new understanding of self-determination is really nothing short of a full paradigm shift in human rights and in global understandings. Under the old colonial framework, Western nations were allowed to essentially impose a gift, as it were, a gift of Western European-designed political and legal institutions onto indigenous communities. That colonial model has at least been delegitimized as a customary norm or customary law, if not always in practice. Gifts may no longer be imposed. no matter how well-intentioned they are. The UN Declaration now has shifted, and the expectation for states is that they are obligated to renegotiate, reconfigure, reformulate their relationships with Indigenous peoples in several ways. First, they are to recognize and protect Indigenous political and legal orders where those orders manage to survive colonialism. And states, second, are obligated, and this is a critical point, to provide space and support for the restoration of Indigenous political and legal orders in cases where they did not survive as well. This principle naturally extends to the maintenance and strengthening of Indigenous peoples' own systems of justice, which is either mentioned specifically or heavily implied in about 7 different articles of the UN Declaration. Now, compliance to date with all of this, with the entire declaration, state compliance is 0. There is not a single state on earth that meets the entire standard of the declaration yet. A few states, most of them in Scandinavia, come the closest. The majority of states in the world are either partially or under-compliant, meaning that they may have fully supported Indigenous rights rhetorically, but their practice is not yet there, and so there's an implementation gap. There are a few states like Russia that are completely what we would call non-compliant. They haven't endorsed them rhetorically, and they haven't made any changes in practice. And then there are these strange categories of English-speaking settler states that operate, I say strange and unique. They keep their commitments to Indigenous rights low, even though some of their actual policies and practices are meeting more of the standards than what they have committed to. So the challenge now, 2015 and moving forward as we look ahead, facing lawyers and scholars and activists, all charged with advancing Indigenous rights, is how we actually go about implementing them in domestic context, so that they do actually fully evolve into international customary law. So when thinking about implementation, I think it's important to remember, again, what I said earlier, the UN Declaration is both a legal and a political document. So its implementation needs to follow this dual pattern, legal and political. So on the legal, it's always important to remember that the UN Declaration is not and was never intended to be a legally binding document in the same way that a treaty or human rights convention is. However, it can be cited in legal cases. And its very first citation came in October 2007, less than a month after its passage by the UN General Assembly. It was cited in a Supreme Court case in Belize. And I think we can expect to see it cited in other domestic cases as more and more countries go into the future. And what's important to remember is Belize is also known as formerly British Honduras. It's a common law country, meaning that its decisions can be cited and serve as precedent in other common law countries. So I think we will expect to see more of that into the future. In Canada, so far, we've had 19 legal cases that have cited the UN Declaration in some respect. So they're hitting on certain issue areas here in Canada in these 19 cases. The duty to consult with First Nations before enacting environmental laws that affect them. We've seen it in trust fund litigation. We've seen it in issues of agency decision-making. Also some treaty fishing rights cases. The duty to consult before enacting laws, some tax immunity legislation, and some education litigation. Another possible legal direct implementation path is constitutional enshrinement. We've seen this in Ecuador and Bolivia, although I think as we could agree of what we've witnessed in recent weeks, this certainly does not mean the resolution of Indigenous peoples' issues on the ground. The second implementation path that I want to discuss is the political. This is more of discursive deployment of Indigenous rights understandings. And it can be deployed and invoked in a number of domestic and international contexts. So I want to highlight a few specific examples on this discursive deployment from the Canadian context, mostly in recent months. Activists, scholars, lawyers are starting to use it, first of all, to highlight violations of Indigenous rights. So there was just a news story last week from Edmonton about police carding, which is police stopping someone on the street and asking for their identification, whether or not they're engaged in any sort of wrongdoing. And this practice has come to the attention of many activists in the area, and so the Grand Chiefs from both Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 issued a formal statement to the media about their concerns that the Edmonton police may be targeting Aboriginal people unfairly. The statement that they issued specifically cited the UN Declaration and this practice as an explicit violation of it. In Canada, we've also had, in recent years, visits by the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people. Canada has gone under universal periodic review at the UN and also review for the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Each and every one of these organizations has issued reports highlighting particular violations of the Canadian state against Indigenous peoples. Another political form, another political path of deployment is using Indigenous rights in the Declaration to set out expectations for implementation. Most recently here, the big example is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report that was released on June 2nd of this year. The report makes 94 broad recommendations to the Canadian government of how to enhance reconciliation between Aboriginal peoples and the state of Canada. What was interesting to note is this report, which was about residential schools and reconciliation of that policy, shifted the discourse and actually made the foundation of the recommendations implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So even though Harper's government has said it will not be implementing these recommendations, the expectation has been set. Interestingly, on the side news last week, I saw a story about something called the LEAP Manifesto. I don't know how many people caught that story. It was a coalition of Canadian authors, artists, national leaders, and activists who issued this manifesto, laying out a bold vision of transition in this country away from fossil fuels and associated with climate change. But again, what I found interesting is they grounded this entire manifesto specifically on implementation of Indigenous rights. And I understand my time is ticking away, so I'm going to jump ahead and just close with a few thoughts that I pulled from Walter Echohawk, who's a Native American, southern side of the border, legal scholar in his new book called The Light of Justice. Echohawk describes, and this is very appropriate, Indigenous rights as planting the seeds of change. The harbinger of change, he writes, asks every nation to restore the human rights of Native peoples that fell by the wayside during the colonial era. If that call is answered, he writes, the Declaration can someday be seen as the Magna Carta for the world's Indigenous peoples. If implemented, those measures will change the world and fundamentally alter the way that humanity views the 350-odd Indigenous peoples who now reside in over 70 nations. So I want to end just by saying the seeds of change have been planted. Where those seeds take us as a global community is slightly undefined and yet to be worked out. But the responsibility inevitably lies with each nation, each community organization, each social and political movement to turn those Indigenous rights norms into lived realities. And so I want to thank you for listening and for inviting me today. It's a pleasure.